Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And I find myself in particularly good spirits today because today brings with it another opportunity, a wonderful chance and opportunity. What a great honor it is for me to be able to once again share with you some thoughts and comments that I have with regard to a feature film directed by the great filmmaker, director, artist extraordinaire, the one, the only, Mr. Brian De Palma. As some of you recall, my dear friends, you and I, over the course of many videos in the past on this channel, we have been going through each of the feature films directed by this great filmmaker, artist, Mr. Brian De Palma. We have been going through the films in a chronological order in terms of his body of work, his filmography. That brings us today to the film which was released in 1976. And it is a film that is considered by many, I think very rightly so, to be one of the greats in the Brian De Palma filmography. It is considered one of the great films of 1970s, again being from 1976. It is also considered one of the most memorable and iconic horror films. Again, it is based upon a screenplay by Lawrence D. Cohen, which is in turn based upon the novel by Stephen King. And this is a film also covering some of the great members of the cast and crew. For instance, producer Paul Monash, editor Paul Hirsch, art directors William Kenny and Jack Fisk, and music by Pino Donaggio, and Mario Tosi is the director of photography, and of course the director of the film, Brian De Palma. And then in terms of the great cast, we have people like Piper Laurie and Betty Buckley and Amy Irving and Nancy Allen and William Catt and PJ Soles and John Travolta, and of course we have Sissy Spacek, who is portraying the title character, the main character, the character whose name is also the title of the film. Sissy Spacek, of course, plays the role of Carrie. And so today, my dear friends, it is my great honor to be able to share with you some thoughts and comments that I have about this wonderful work, Carrie. So as we have been doing before, let me share with you my comments in two parts. The first part is a non-spoiler general discussion, again for the benefit of those who have not yet seen this film, Carrie. So we'll have the first part be a general non-spoiler discussion. Then we will turn to a second part, which will be a spoiler discussion, a detailed spoiler discussion. I will mark the video discussion when we turn to that, again, for the benefit of those who have not yet seen this film. So with that in mind, let us go right to it. Let us cut to the chase and talk about this film, again, in a non-spoiler general discussion way. So how do we first talk about this film, Carrie? What can we say about this film, Carrie? I think we can talk about the plot in, again, general terms. Carrie is, of course, referring to our main character, Carrie White. This is Sissy Spacek's character, who is a high school student, a young high school girl. And we see immediately, or almost immediately, how she is in what could be described as a socially awkward situation in the context of her high school community. And we also see her in certain aspects of her life and the environment as a type of coming-of-age drama, and also how she is interacting with people around her and how that affects her and her view of herself as an individual, as a young woman, and also how it affects the community around her, or shall I say the communities around her. Now I say communities with an S in the plural because I think there are a number of communities that we can say are part of the film and part of the plot in regards to this main character of Carrie White. So the first of such communities could be said to be the high school community. That is, those people or those characters in the high school milieu that we see through various points of character arc, dynamic, and plots and subplots. We see each of these characters in their own respective ways, relating to or somehow or another, responding to, whether it be positive or not so positive, responding to Carrie White as a character, as an individual. So some of these other characters are, for example, Sue and Chris. So this is Amy Irving's character and Nancy Allen's character, respectively. And then we have people like, and then by extension, P.J. Soles and John Travolta and William Catt and others. And then also we have, in terms of, say, parental or authority, teacher authority figures, we have people like Miss Collins, Betty Buckley character, and how each of these characters, again, in the high school milieu backdrop, how we see them in one form or another respond to or relate to Carrie, and how those responses provide character and emotional beats, as well as plot beats and propulsions forward of the plot, beginning, middle, and the end. And my goodness, the inexorable way in which this film glides through and travels through the beginning, middle, and end. That's part of the appeal, and that's part of the thrill, and that's part of the impact, entertainment value that is the film Carrie. And that's one aspect, or that's one community. The other aspect or other community that can be said to be at work here is the interior or the personal aspect of Carrie White as an individual. And this, in turn, I think can be further categorized into a number of camps. The first of such camps is the relationship that is depicted between Carrie White, this young girl, and her mother being Margaret White, portrayed by Piper Laurie. Now, this is a key relationship in the film. And again, without going into too much detail at the moment, one can say that it is a very significant one. It is one which has a lot of impact and emotional draw, and also a lot of effect and a lot of significance, both in terms of how Carrie White views herself, also in terms of the parent-child, mother-daughter relationship, also the coming-of-age relationship that is part of the high school milieu backdrop storyline of Carrie the film, and also other things in terms of how all the characters in this world are affected. A lot of it can be said to be directly or indirectly related to or derived from this key relationship between mother and daughter, Margaret White and Carrie White, Piper Laurie and Sissy Spacek's character. So that's one aspect or one camp of the interior examination of this character, Carrie White. The other camp or component of this interior examination is also Carrie White herself. Her character dynamics, how she views herself, how she is trying to know more about herself and discover more about herself, and that journey being such a key emotional through line of this film. That also involves her discovery or her interaction with what one might say is a type of power or type of, say, trait or something that she has, an ability, a special ability that Carrie White has. And this special ability or this power slowly and in a well-balanced and well-paced fashion emerges throughout various points of this film. So Carrie White and her power. How this emerges, how she begins to become aware of it, how she tries to deal with it, and what are the ramifications and outcomes and consequences of this power. And how does this power of Carrie White connect to these other points that we were talking about? Her relationship with the high school community around her, all the various people that we meet in this high school milieu, how her power affects that, and also how her powers affect or are affected by her relationship with her mother, Margaret White. And so I think that could be said to be, in a nutshell, the plot or the general story structure of Carrie, the film. Now, I should point out here that this film is often regarded, and I think very rightly so, as a horror film. It is regarded as a horror film because it is, of course, based upon the novel by Stephen King. And Stephen King, I'm a big fan of Stephen King works. I've read Stephen King works a number of times, including the work Carrie. This video discussion isn't meant to be any type of specific breakdown in terms of the analysis of book versus film adaptation or anything like that. But let me say, just in the context of this first part of the discussion, that the association with Stephen King, especially over the years, especially as since this point of the 1970s, Stephen King's career as an author, as well as his film adaptations of his works, has just grown and grown and grown since this point of 1976. Of course, that association has become very strong indeed, such that this film does carry with it, again, very rightly so, the label of horror film. And that too is derived from the content or the story of the film itself. There are a lot of shocks, there are some scares, there are some jolts that can be said to be of the horror film genre fabric. And so for those who have not yet seen the film, if you are not a fan of horror films, or if horror films, the genre is not your cup of tea, then perhaps this film isn't for you. And that's perfectly okay. You don't have to enjoy the horror film genre if it's not your cup of tea. That's totally fine. I have no problem with that. Of course, your film journey is your own, my dear, dear friends. But for those who are okay with the horror film genre, then I think, if you have not yet seen CARRIE, then I think CARRIE is a great place to go for another great example of the horror film. Now, I mentioned the horror film genre, but I think it is a film that is not just a horror film. And indeed, too, when one thinks about it, again, I'll try to maintain my comments within the non-spoiler territory here, but I think we can say, generally speaking, how in terms of the film's pacing, in terms of the film's, say, plot balance, we can say that it is not all a horror film genre vibe. There are horror film elements to it. There are shocks and scares to this film, that's for sure. But there is also a way in which this film has this pacing and balance to it such that it allows for many different elements or genres or emotional points to be embedded and intertwined and encompassed within this work CARRIE, such that it can be described as being not just a horror film. Now, what do I mean by this? So first of all, it does have a coming-of-age drama quality about it, and that's due, I think, in great part to the quality of the performances, in particular people like Amy Irving and Nancy Allen and of course, Sissy Spacek. And others. We see how these characters, the high school students, are trying to essentially come to terms with and understand themselves as they are growing, as they are interacting with others, and in particular CARRIE White in this situation, the coming of age aspect of her character journey. And so that also brings with it too a very heartfelt and emotional drama element beats to it. And so this film does have that feeling of a drama, a very heartwarming drama on the one hand, also a very tragic drama on the other hand, because there are moments that could be said to be having high points, emotional high points, and emotional low points, and everything in between. And that is the stuff of great drama. So this film can be described, therefore, as being, in that context, very, very comfortably and very triumphantly. There are also moments, too, where this film has the element of the comedy routine, the way in which this film has certain stylistic points showing the way in which high school hijinks occurs. There's also the way in which the style seems to portray a silent film aesthetic quality to it as well, and other clever twists of cinematic style and verve and energy that really give a sense of, say, a comic timing and dynamism. Like we said, to be another element of this film, CARRIE. So this is, again, my way to try to describe this film as being a film which has many genre hats to it. And this, I think, when we think about our previous discussions of Brian De Palma films, I don't think this is surprising, right? Because we have discussed Brian De Palma films in the past as being just that, being films that can wear many different genre hats at the same time. So he is a filmmaker that maybe is very famous for making the suspense thriller film with homage touches to, say, works by Alfred Hitchcock and others. And indeed, that's the case for many of his films in the past, and that will definitely be the case for many films going forward. And it's certainly the case for a film like CARRIE. There are suspense, thriller, and yes, indeed, horror aspects that are so brilliantly rendered and so memorable and effective through and through. But there are also these comic elements and these drama elements and romance elements that are part of the Brian De Palma film fabric dynamic. And that's certainly the case for a film like CARRIE. And so here is another great case to be made for Brian De Palma as a multi-purpose filmmaker artist who can make films that really encompass many different genres at the same time, including romance, including drama, including comedy. as well as the horror and suspense. And Carrie is a great example of that. So that's one thing. Now, another thing too that can afford is this way in which this film can turn almost on a dime from one extreme pole to another extreme. And that turn from one extreme to another is so effective and so almost exhilarating from the viewpoint of the viewer that I think it makes for a very compelling watch indeed that can afford rewatch and rewatch and rewatch over and over again. Because what it means, it has a varying degree of shifts and styles that create a sense of dynamism to the plot, while also giving room for the characters to live and breathe, thus giving us, the viewers, the way in to connecting with them and sympathizing with them on an emotional level, on a character level. And this point, too, of connecting with characters is also very important. One of the great strengths of a Brian De Palma film, such as Carrie, is the way in which he's able to shift to different points of view, different perspectives of various characters at the same time, or within the space of the film. So he gives us the point of view of one character, and then sometimes he'll shift to the point of view of another character, and then he'll shift to a point of view of yet another character. And all the time with these shifts, we associate and sympathize with the characters whose point of view we share at that given moment in the film. But then when we go to a different character, sometimes we realize that the character that we had a point of view at one moment to is completely antagonistic to now our current perspective. And so we can go to differing point of views, different perspectives from different characters, and their relationships can be quite antagonistic. They can be rivals, they can be enemies even. And so one character that we sympathize with in one moment can be regarded as an enemy or as a villain or as a monster the next moment. That is so striking. This film, Carrie, does that so well. One moment our sympathies are with one character, and the next moment we see that same character as a monster, as a villain, as someone who is scary. And then we see that same character again in a completely sympathetic light. And that almost roller coaster ride of emotional associations, I think, also adds to the sense of well-paced, off-kilter sensibilities about this film that gives a sense of our viewership being on edge and can be surprised and jolted at any moment, while at the same time holding our interest because we're still so heavily invested emotionally with each of these characters, including, and perhaps as a great example, or the primary example, our association with this utterly complex, so well-rounded, and so nuanced character that is Carrie White, portrayed by Sissy Spacek. And so, I can say more in the spoilers, or I'll save my comments for the spoiler section about the specific plot points. But let me just say too that these feelings of connection, as well as the roller coaster ride aspect that is reflective of the Brian De Palma filmography writ large, can be said also to be enhanced or further solidified by the great performances that we see. I mentioned Sissy Spacek. There's also Betty Buckley, Amy Irving, Nancy Allen, P.J. Soles, John Travolta, Piper Laurie, of course, William Catt. They bring with it such a freshness and life and energy. And sometimes those energies can be consistent with each other. Sometimes they can collide and be at odds with each other. And when they collide, my goodness, the fireworks that are on display with Carrie, stand back because you're in for one heck of a ride indeed. And that heck of a ride is also further enhanced from the viewpoint of the camera movements and styles, the slow motion, and the photography, as well as the application of the music, the Pino Donaggio score, which has this lullaby effect, but also suddenly turns into jolts and scares, while also giving us a sense of the emotional resonance and impact and quality. And all of this, again, in the hands of the great director that is Brian De Palma, you are in for a real cinematic treat indeed. What a film this is. I love this film so much. I've seen this film since I was very young, and it has been with me in terms of my own cinema journey very consistently, very regularly, up to the present day. And I dare say it will continue to be a part of my cinema journey for a long time to come. Now, before we get into the spoiler section of this discussion, let me say, too, that there are many releases of this film, physical releases of this film. I haven't yet gotten the 4K release of this. I want to, but I'll try to do that maybe after this video discussion, but I know that has been recently released as around the start of this, as of the time of making this video, which is the start of 2023. And also there have been other releases too in the past. For instance, I have the Scream Factory 2-disc Blu-ray set on the table here. There have also been some releases by Arrow, which have been really great. So you have many options, my dear friends, for watching this film in terms of physical media releases, and also I would assume other options for streaming, etc., should those be the case. So if you are interested in watching another great Brian De Palma film, if you're okay with watching horror films, then, and if you haven't seen the film Carrie, then I strongly suggest checking this film out. It is a stunner. It is a real stunner. And I will try now in the spoiler section to explain with a little bit more detail why I feel that way about this film, which is Carrie. All right, my dear friends, so you're back, which means that it's okay to speak about spoilers when it comes to this film, Carrie. So once again, my dear friends, this is my appeal to you. For those who have not yet seen this film, Carrie, my strong suggestion is that you turn off this video right now and you can watch the film at your own pace and then come back at any time, and at which time we can talk, you and I, about this film, Carrie. I'm always going to be here, so I always look forward to what it is you have to say. But from here on in, let's speak about specifics and the film itself in a spoiler discussion. And so you are still here, which means it's okay to speak about the film in a spoiler manner. And so I'd like to mention just how much I really love this film. I have seen this film so many times since I was young, and I have regularly visited this film and revisited this film, and I have so many copies of it. I've seen it over the years many times. It's one of my favorite Brian De Palma films. It is one of my favorite Stephen King film adaptations, and everything about it just sparkles and shines and shocks and thrills and terrifies, and also makes me happy and sad all at once at the same time. And I describe it in those terms because I've mentioned in my earlier Brian De Palma discussions thus far about how one of my viewpoints of Brian De Palma films is that he is a filmmaker that is able to craft films that can wear many genre hats at once. I mentioned it a little bit earlier in the non-spoiler discussion, but let me say it here. So, for example, the horror film element of this film, Carrie, can be said to be derived from, say, the telekinesis power element of Carrie White. And that is something that is, of course, full-blown and drawn out in this climactic, fiery rage sort of way in the iconic prom sequence that carries the film to its conclusion. There's also the horror film element, arguably speaking, in the hands of the Margaret White-Carrie White relationship, and specifically Piper Laurie's depiction of Margaret White, the mother, and how her almost aggressive stance towards her daughter, towards religion, towards her views of sexuality, and, say, the coming-of-age aspect of the story of Carrie White in this film, Carrie, and how Margaret White almost violently reacts to that. How Margaret White can be said also to be, in a way, a monster in her own right, and that she, thus being a monster, creates a kind of horror film aspect, at least in the dynamic of the Margaret White-Carrie White relationship, which is arguably one of the most important, if not the most important relationship in this film, Carrie. So there are at least a couple of ways in which this film carries out the horror film vibe in a wonderfully rich and effective way. But that's not all, because this film also carries with it a drama sense. It has a high school milieu aspect to it. It has a comedy slapstick aspect to it. For instance, the sequence involving the tuxedos, the boys going in trying to get tuxedos, Tommy Ross and his friends trying to get tuxedos, etc., with the zany music going on, or maybe the what happens with the detention and the girls and Miss Collins and all the sequences involving the jumping jacks and the push-ups, etc. So There are moments where it has a slapstick, almost silent film-esque quality to it that relies on physical comedy and the like, and cuts and almost sped-up motion and high-pitched frequencies, etc. So there's also this idea of the changing of genres that also provides the room for Brian De Palma to essentially play in the sandbox that is the cinematic form, thus providing the room for Brian De Palma, again, showcasing his talents, again, combined with the great people on the crew, such as Mario Tosi as director of photography and Pino Donaggio and the music, etc., but also showing us, again, why Brian De Palma films are Brian De Palma films. Part of why they're so great is the way in which camera moves and cinematic tricks, almost in a nouvelle vague experimental film-like fashion. So when we get all of that and then some in this film, CARRIE, in this great way. Now, that's, of course, another way to say that this film, one of the great things about this film is that it can shift in these various, say, modes or genres or styles very, very effectively all at once. And I think it does so in a manner that can be effective, at least from my subjective viewpoint, in at least two ways. So the first of such ways is I think it allows for the sudden shifts of genre from, say, the lull and the calm of a slow motion romantic aspect of the film, such as, say, the very end of the film, when we have the slow motion dream sequence of Sue Snell as she's visiting the plot, the now vacant plot, which also stands or serves as the grave site of Carrie White. And she's putting the flowers on the gravesite as one final gesture, one final goodbye, one final sign of respect, or trying to make amends for the wrong that Sue Snell apparently understands that she committed at the very start of the film with this humiliation in the shower when Carrie White is having her period, throwing the towels. Chris doesn't seem to mind that. She seems to have relished that, whereas Sue, at this moment, after she's shaken by Miss Collins, seems to then express not just doubt but also regret in doing what it is she's doing. So at the very end, as she's at least trying to make amends. This, of course, goes to hell because what happens is, of course, the final jump scare of the bloodied hand that comes out of the ground there. Now, this is a very important sequence, not just in terms, well, it's important for a number of reasons. One, it's a great jump scare. It's one of the great ways in which a Brian De Palma film ends. Arguably, it's probably one of the best ways that a Brian De Palma film ends, one of the most famous ways that a Brian De Palma film ends. So it's that one final leap into the realm of horror. To remind us that, yes, indeed, this is a film that very strongly and very proudly wears its horror genre hat with such a blaze of glory. But also it serves to remind us that this film has the ability not just to encompass various genres, but tend to shift from one genre to another in an instant. It's causing complete chaos and off-kilter shifting of balance in a way that unsettles the viewer, but also leaves a lingering presence that will just make the films ever so rewatchable and ever so entertaining at the same time. So in the context of the ending, the Sue Snell dream sequence is the romantic element. It is the moment where we are sympathizing with Sue Snell as a type of heroine, trying to do the quote-unquote good thing for Carrie White in the end. And it's accompanied by the lovely, slow, melodic nature of the Pino Donaggio score that suddenly turns to hell, shifts into high gear, the high horror gear. And so that is not just the shift in horror, but also a reminder of how this film is covering a wide gamut of various tones and styles and genres, and that not just allowing for, and that allows for the sudden shifts and pushing us off balance, thus to give us even more reason to be on edge as we watch even the quote-unquote the calm and romantic scenes. So that's a great gift of this film, CARRIE. Now, there's another benefit to watching, to having these various forms, which is it also allows for the ability and room to see our characters think and maneuver and grow and live and breathe. So, for instance, this film also has the drama element to it, the romantic element to it, and also the high school drama element to it, which therefore allows us to get to know characters like Miss Collins, like Chris, like Norma, like Sue Snell, etc. And we not only get to know them, but we can maybe sympathize with what it is they're feeling. So we get glimpses of, say, Miss Collins talking with the principal or talking with Carrie White. She might seem one way with Carrie White. It might seem another way when she's talking to someone else. And so that reveals a type of human, three-dimensional sided nature to Miss Collins as a character that maybe she's not wholly sympathetic, or maybe she's not 100% on Carrie's side, but at least she's trying. And even those human moments, which might show a sense of maybe vulnerability, but they also show a type of grounded nature, or a kind of a sympathetic or understandable nature to Miss Collins. Another case in point that shows this too, that in the quote-unquote non-horror element of the prom sequence, when things are calm and romantic and happy, there's the moment, the lovely moment between Miss Collins and Carrie, where Miss Collins is talking about her date. And it was the captain of the basketball team, and he was very tall, and she had to wear high heels, and the car broke down, they had to walk, and so it caused her feet to be so sore that she couldn't dance, but they ended up talking, and it was a really lovely time. And so that's a lovely anecdote, because it reminds us again of the human quality of a character like Miss Collins. I guess also there's a link between, I guess, basketball and the fact that she gets impaled with the basketball board just a few moments later, I suppose. But the point that I wanted to bring up here is that the film, as it shifts outside of the quote-unquote horror film realm, it allows for the characters to live and breathe, and thus for us as viewers to get to know them, such as Miss Collins, such as Sue Snell, and how she interacts, how she responds to this horrible act that she recognizes that she's done at the very outset of the film with Carrie. And also how she's trying to make amends in terms of her convincing Tommy Ross, the William Catt character, to take Carrie White out to the prom. And so we see that side of her as well. And this is not a horror film element, arguably. This is instead a type of high school romance drama element that is further enhanced by Tommy Ross's relationship with Carrie White, and how that has the potential of bringing Carrie out of her shell, so to speak. And she's very excited, Carrie White is. And when we shift to Carrie's perspective, how she's very excited, how she makes her own dress, how she reacts to Tommy, how when they're together, they seem very much like they're into each other. And arguably, while Tommy Ross might be said to have been having different motives for taking Carrie White out to the prom, ultimately it can be interpreted that he ends up at a place where he is coming from a place of sincere, earnest feelings towards Carrie White. At least the interpretation is possible. And so that's a way to say, therefore, that this is a film that when it shifts into those other modes, it also allows for us, the viewers, to get to know these characters and get to sympathize with them and get to maybe understand what it is they are thinking and why it is they do what it is they do. I mean, this is, I think, also very prevalent when it comes to Carrie White herself. When it turns into these moments of her interacting with, say, Miss Collins or Tommy, etc., these are moments for her to possibly, as I say, come out of her shell, to grow into someone that she wasn't at the start of the film, and that person that she was at the start of the film, after she misses the volleyball, after she is humiliated in the shower, after she experiences this moment of her period, and she doesn't understand that what it is until a little bit later, and it causes this terrible humiliation in the shower, of course, that opens the film. She grows, or she is able to move beyond that humiliation, at least to a certain degree, or at least the potential is there, in this relationship with Tommy Ross. And again, this is the quote-unquote non-horror aspect of the film, and it allows for us to get to know these characters in particular, or for example, the main character of Carrie White. And this is so important because it gives us the chance to breathe. It gives us a nice set of pacing for when the horror elements occur. They really occur, do they not? And they have a sudden burst of energy, even in the bursts that occur at the very beginning, with the exploding light, or the flipping cigarette ashtray, or the creepy Carrie kid falling off of the bike, and the breaking of the mirror, etc. When these happen, they have the wonderful high-pitched soundtrack musical shrieks that are very much an homage to Bernard Herrmann's score from Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho from 1960. They occur in flashes, but they come and go in instants. And they also do not ultimately take away from the other motives of those sequences, namely showing the concern that Miss Collins has for Carrie, or showing the humiliation that Carrie feels, or showing the frustration that Carrie feels after having been humiliated and still being called Cassie Wright, etc. And so these bursts do happen, but they don't interfere, and these bursts are quote-unquote the horror elements because they are aspects or expressions of the telekinetic powers of Carrie White. But they never, I would say, interfere with the other drama elements that are occurring in those sequences at the same time. And so that is a wonderful thing about this film, how it balances all these different tones and points of view, or I'm sorry, not points of view, but tones and styles and genres in a way that it balances them in a way that doesn't interfere with them. It allows for the human drama elements to grow while also maintaining the slow burn aspect of the horror film element of the telekinesis plot line that then suddenly bursts into flames at the very climax of the film with the prom, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But then this is, again, my way, therefore, to say that the blending of styles allows for wonderful pacing. It also allows for wonderful shifts in energy, and also allows for us being on edge while also at the same time getting to know the characters and getting to know them, I think, very, very well. So that's one of the great strengths of this film. And then I should say, too, that in connection with that, or related to this idea of the combination of styles or blends or genres, various hats being worn at once, which is also a very strong trait of a Brian De Palma film, as I mentioned earlier, that also allows for wonderful pacing in the sense that we can visit each of these characters and we can shift our perspective, or our point of view, or POV shifts every time we go to a different character. So, for instance, sometimes the film will be devoted to Carrie White, and during those moments it could be said that we see Carrie White as a type of sympathetic victim, or someone who has been so terribly humiliated to the point of tragic proportions. And also when we see her in the context of her relationship with Margaret White, the Piper Laurie character, we understand that she's not just a victim of circumstances at school, but also, in a certain point of view anyway, or maybe many points of view, she's also a victim of circumstances at home. And that might be the reason why she is a so-called quote-unquote social outcast, as she is, we recognize her from the very start of the film. So in these ways, when we get the moments of the film that are focusing on Carrie White, we can arguably sympathize with her so much. Then we also see how the film shifts perspective to other characters and how their perspectives might or might not be in line with the perspective of the character with whom we have just shared moments just previously. So, for example, when the film shifts from Carrie White's perspective to, say, Miss Collins' perspective, we see that maybe Miss Collins is not always sympathetic to Carrie White. She does express, for instance, how she too, out of earshot of Carrie White, she says this when she says how she too felt and understood the frustration of the girls in the shower, because she understood that this was Carrie White experiencing her period for the first time. And the other girls in the shower room understood that as well. Carrie White, unfortunately, did not understand it, again, because of the circumstances involving Margaret White, Piper Laurie's character, and etc. But that shift in perspective from Carrie White's perspective to Miss Collins' perspective is so key, because it also gives room for the idea that maybe there is more disconnect between the characters than meets the eye. After all, when Carrie White and Miss Collins are together, it seems like Miss Collins is 100% on Carrie White's side. But when she's out of the room, or when we get her Miss Collins' perspective wholly, maybe that's not entirely the case. And so maybe there's a sense of disconnect between Miss Collins and Carrie that could have significant ramifications when we get to the film's climax. So not only does the shift in perspective, I think, give us a sense of who these characters are and the various, say, reasons and motivations that they might have, but also it serves to illuminate or illustrate or highlight just how disconnected characters are. And this disconnect or this distance between characters, I think, is so important because it leads into another key point that I see in the film anyway, which is not only do you have characters that are disconnected, but it could be said that this disconnect leads to differing or perhaps wrongful interpretations of the same series of events. In other words, we might have two or more characters that are looking upon the same set of events or circumstances that are occurring in the film, but each character interprets them differently. And it's their different interpretation that can cause significant ramifications in terms of the plot. For example, remember that lovely sequence, a very famous sequence in The Prom, after Tommy Ross and Carrie White have been voted, I should say, because we understand there have been some shenanigans by Norma and the others thanks to Chris and Billy, I guess primarily Chris, but in any event, they have been voted, and so they are on their way to the stage with the lovely Pino Donaggio music, and all the main players of the film are there in that space. So Tommy Ross and Carrie White are standing up, slow motion walking. This is Carrie White's happiest moment. And then, of course, we have Miss Collins' slow motion clapping. Of course, she is happy for Carrie as well. Amy Irving's Sue Snell, we see, has snuck into the room, and she sees from the backdrop there how they've been voted. And she is happy for Carrie White as well, because we understand her motivations, that she wanted to do a good thing, which is try to help Carrie White and maybe find some happiness for her again, to make amends for the wrong that she understands that she has committed against Carrie White in terms of being part of that terrible prank, humiliating prank at the start of the film. So that's Sue Snell. So she's back there. And of course we have under the stage Chris and Billy. And Chris, of course, with that wonderful silhouetted grabbing of the rope, just almost shivering in delight, almost orgiastic delight, just waiting for the moment to rip the cord, in a manner of speaking. So all this stuff is happening. Now, remember when Sue recognizes that there's a rope that's tied up to a bucket, and it seems like whatever's in the bucket, when it falls, will land on there's a streamer that falls, and it indicates to Amy Irving's Sue, and indeed to us, that she now understands that something terrible is about to happen with this bucket. Now that look of recognition, that shocked look of recognition, is on her face, just as Tommy and Carrie kiss on stage. Now this is important because also in the audience, I mentioned Miss Collins is there slow motion. She looks in the corner of her eye and she sees Sue Snell, and she is really angry, and then she looks to the stage because she sees that Sue is looking at the stage. Sue is, of course, looking at the stage because now Sue is realizing that the bucket's there and everyone's in danger, while Tommy Ross and Carrie White are kissing at that very moment. Now, Miss Collins interprets this to mean that Sue is upset that Tommy Ross and Carrie White are kissing on stage. So instead of Miss Collins perhaps helping Sue to try to stop this terrible thing from happening, Miss Collins wrongly interprets Sue Snell's reaction to mean that she is somehow maybe jealous of Carrie White, and so she unleashes her anger not towards whatever might be happening under the stage with Chris, but rather she unleashes her anger towards Sue Snell. And so Sue Snell becomes a victim of Miss Collins' rage, in a manner of speaking, and that clears the road for the final coup de grace from Chris, which is the pulling of the cord and the ultimate humiliation of Carrie White, which of course leads to the chaos, horror, chaos, murder, mayhem, and death. But my point here is that this is a wrong interpretation of the same set of events. Sue Snell is looking at one set of events. Miss Collins is looking at a similar set of events, or at the same space anyway, but the interpretation is wholly wrong, and it leads to some really significant ramifications going forward. And so this is an instance where we see not just the disconnect between and among characters, but also miscommunication and misinterpretation, and indeed wrongful interpretation that leads to some pretty serious consequences indeed. This idea of the disconnect or distance between and among characters, I think, is so important as well, because it also exists with other characters. So, for example, we have Margaret White and Carrie White, and we can say, for instance, that with regard to the powers, the telekinetic powers that Carrie White reveals to Margaret during the very, I think, wonderfully, melodramatically laid out sort of dinner sequence, and the thunder, etc. And I love that sequence too, because this is a type of recognition, a sort of not just a sort of a resistance towards her mother, standing up against her mother in this show of defiance on the part of Carrie White. So in a way, it's a real important character arc development of Carrie White's character, but also it's a revelation of her powers. And this is a great thing too, because we have two characters, Carrie and Margaret, looking upon the same set of facts or events, namely the powers of Carrie White, but each of them is interpreting very differently. Carrie seems to be interpreting her powers as almost a type of ability or means by which she can express herself and find that she is not a loner, that she is not strange, but in fact she can understand who she is and where she's coming from. And this is a very important point. And so this also allows for her to assert a kind of confidence, self-confidence that she hasn't had throughout most of the film up to now. So in that way, she's interpreting her powers as a means to show not just defiance, but self-confidence at the same time. This is very important in the context of her character arc. Now, Margaret seems to be interpreting those powers and also being upset at Carrie's, say, defiance and wanting to go to the prom, etc. And she then interprets, at this point, and then beyond this, in other parts of the film as well, she interprets her powers as not being anything to be proud of, but rather being something, powers of a witch, something from the devil, etc. And that is taken to a huge, huge extreme by the very end of the film, as we know, because of what she tries to do when she tries to kill Carrie with the knife there. So this is another example of two different characters that are interpreting or that are looking upon the same set of facts or data points, namely the powers of Carrie White, but then interpreting them in a wholly, radically, and extremely different manner. And that extremity is not just indicative of their characters, namely, say, Margaret White's, say, religious fanaticism, and Carrie's attempts to try to grow out of her shell, but also this disconnect and this varying interpretation that each of the characters has also, and the extreme nature of the difference also is so important to the plot, because it leads to the ultimate choice that Margaret makes at the end of the film, namely wanting to kill her own daughter. And also it leads into the way in which this film blends into the various genres, because, as I mentioned, this film is a horror film, and is a horror film because of the powers of Carrie White, but also because of the monstrous, towering nature of Margaret White, as exemplified at the very end of the film, where she wants to kill Carrie, and not only is she wielding a knife, but she's smiling at the same time. Now that's pretty vicious and monstrous indeed, if I were, if I do say so myself. And so, again, this idea of disconnect and misinterpretation leads to various avenues that are, I think, have this kind of interlattice way of being a kind of integrated whole of this film, Carrie, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. And I should say, too, that this notion of interpretation or wrong interpretation, or perhaps interpretation under stress that might not necessarily reflect what is actually happening. I mentioned this in the context of Margaret White's interpretation of the powers versus Carrie White's interpretation of the powers, or Miss Collins' interpretation of what Sue is there for versus what Sue is interpreting all the events of the bucket and the stage of the prom, what that leads to, and the terrible tragic consequences that follow. This is also occurring in another key moment, and this is such an important moment too, one of the most ambiguous moments in the film, subject to a lot of possible interpretation. That is the reaction of Carrie at the point that she has been totally humiliated. The pig's blood has been poured on her in this cruel prank by Chris, and she is on stage. She's totally humiliated. She's alone because now Tommy has fallen because of the bucket hitting him on the head. He is unconscious, and we understand very seriously injured. She is alone standing there. And what does she see as the camera zooms into her face? We have this almost kaleidoscopic, maybe bug-eye view way in which there's a swirl, and she sees people in the audience and they are laughing. And we also hear voiceovers. They're all going to laugh at you. We're all sorry, Cassie. Plug it up, plug it. Trust me, Carrie. You can trust me in this type of repeated type of way. And so we understand that this is all a type of trauma that Carrie White is experiencing in this ultimate moment of total humiliation. Now, are the people in the audience actually laughing or not? Now, that is, I think, a very good question. There are parts of this sequence that could show, or that could lead one to interpret the scene such that, yes, indeed, people are laughing, or at least some people in the audience are laughing. You know, there are moments where we see people trying to go for the doors, and in the backdrop, some extras are laughing, or they're smiling at least. And so that could be an indication, and it's out of this, it's not in this bug-eyed kaleidoscopic viewpoint that we understand is from Carrie's point of view. And so we do see some people that are laughing beyond this, say, kaleidoscopic camera work. So that could be an indication that they are indeed laughing in the actuality of the space. Or at least smiling, who knows. But we don't see all of the characters that are in this kaleidoscopic viewpoint outside of this. In other words, when we see Miss Collins laughing, we only see it in this kaleidoscopic viewpoint. We never see her laughing, at least I don't think so, outside of that kind of a strange camera work. And so query whether indeed she or others or all of them are laughing, or perhaps maybe she wasn't laughing, who knows. Again, it's subject to interpretation. Another point that could support that the interpretation that maybe they weren't laughing at all was, remember, after this happens, we see the backstage and Chris and Billy coming out of the from under the rafter, under the stage there, and they're laughing and they're kind of giggling. At least to my ear, I don't hear any pronounced laughter or echo of laughter from the main hall or the main part of that auditorium. You'd think it's all connected, right? So you'd think that if people were actually laughing, it would be echoing off the walls, and you'd hear it in the backdrop as Chris and Billy, John Travolta and Nancy Allen, are getting out of there. But we don't hear it, at least I don't hear it anyway. And so maybe it's there and I'm not catching it, but it seems quite quiet indeed. And so that could also be a suggestion that maybe it's all in Carrie's head. Now, if that interpretation holds, and I think there's reasonable grounds to think that, at least it's possible to at least have that interpretation. If that interpretation holds, what that means ultimately is that Carrie White is wrongfully or mistakenly interpreting the situation, the scene, such that she thinks that everyone is laughing at her. And if she is doing that, then that is an interpretation of a series of facts that is inaccurate and mistaken. But that mistaken interpretation leads to some really horrifying consequences indeed, because it leads to her rage. She turns into a monster and she kills basically everyone in the very famous or infamous prom sequence. So there's another example of, again, if that interpretation holds, there's another example of a character, namely Carrie White, looking on a set of circumstances and misjudging them, or wrongfully or mistakenly interpreting them in a way that ultimately leads her into monster Carrie mode. So that is, I think, a great example of, or the possible example of, again, how this film not only shows us shifting perspectives, POV shifts, different modes of genre that go from one to the other, that shift from one to the other, but also how these shifting perspectives and shifting genres also give way to the possibility or identification of how distant the characters are. They really are from each other. And so, and I really love that. I love how we can have almost varying points of view. It almost has a type of the Kurosawa film Rashomon. It almost has a type of nuanced Rashomon quality to it, which I find fascinating. And again, in the hands of Brian De Palma, that's really great because, Brian De Palma films, a lot of it is too about how he shows in his cinema the viewpoint and the shifting perspectives. Case in point, the split screen. Split screen in Brian De Palma's hands is a way to show so many things, simultaneous actions happening at the same time within the same frame. But it also means of showing differing perspectives that are occurring at the same time. And those differing perspectives are oftentimes happening in the same space. And so we have different points of view on the same set of circumstances, which is, again, emblematic of how CARRIE operates, not just in the shifting perspectives, how the plot and character arcs are played out, but also in the frame itself, because there's the moment in the prom sequence when we do get the split screen and we have differing points of view happening simultaneously. So that's, I think, the ultimate cinematic visual expression of what I'm trying to say here, which is this film is, it's many things, one of which being the encapsulation in cinematic form and also character arc and plot dynamic form of various shifting POVs and shifting perspectives. And the shift of perspectives indicates further to us just how distant the characters are between and among each other. It's brilliant. And of course, we should also mention too the great way in which this film, as a Brian De Palma film, operates in that wonderful sort of realm of Brian De Palma cinema magic. And I mentioned the split screen just now. There's also the lovely Mario Tosi camera work, the slow motion glides, the way it travels and flies through space, and almost the over the or maybe the bird's eye view shots when Carrie falls down the stairs after she's been stabbed by Margaret White, or when Margaret earlier on in the film is cutting the vegetables there, and the vegetable falls, and she's still stabbing the board with the knife in a kind of cut manner, which is very frightening indeed. On other aspects, and the way the camera tracks and glides through the environment, time and space. So this is, again, very indicative and very much a characteristic of the Brian De Palma film aesthetic, in a manner of speaking. Also, too, the way that the music and the soundtrack enhance this. The Pino Donaggio score, I mentioned how it can go from place to place to place and shock us, but also lull us into a sense of calm and relaxation, and then jolt us once again with some high-pitched psycho-like strings, and then bring us back to a sense of pathos and tragedy, while also giving us comedy and zaniness and romance and the zest of youth, but then turning it into disaster and mayhem and chaos at the same time, leading us to the final and then cut. I mean, that cut from the last shot of Sue being shocked and being held by her mother as the camera tracks back, and that pulsating refrain of the Pino Donaggio score, it's shocking, absolutely shocking, and it cuts to silence, and then the lovely opening theme music, the romantic, slow theme music of Carrie comes, and that's one of the great musical representations of what I'm trying to express here, which is the shock of going from one genre to another is exemplified in that moment. The shock of going from that super heightened horror theme to silence, and then to the slow, mellifluous and beautiful refrain of the opening title music. And that is, again, it's hard to get one's bearings. It's brilliant for that. So again, the music is so important. And then I would be remiss if I didn't applaud the great performances of the actors in this film. I mentioned the great cast here, but the cast and the performances and the shifting perspectives, again, bring us so much in terms of getting to know these characters. I mentioned Amy Irving and William Catt and Tommy Ross and Sue Snell, of course, and they have a type of sense of maybe almost innocent charm about them. Again, they're trying to, quote-unquote, do the right thing, and maybe their feelings are coming from a good place. Queer, of course, whether indeed what they're doing is maybe morally appropriate or not. I mean, are they really doing it for a truly benevolent motives, or maybe are they doing it for somewhat selfish motives? Maybe in particular Sue Snell. Is she really trying to do the quote-unquote good thing, or maybe is she trying to prove to herself that she is good by helping someone quote-unquote less fortunate than her in the form of Carrie White? Again, maybe there is room to interpret what she is doing as not wholly benevolent, or not as benevolent as meets the eye. But that notwithstanding, the performance by Amy Irving is magnificent. And then also there's the great performance of William Katt as Tommy Ross. I love this because the great progression, he's totally unexcited about taking Carrie White to the prom, but slowly but surely, at least one can interpret his feelings to be coming from a genuine place, a sincere, genuine place. And it climaxes in that wonderful, in the prom sequence, of course, but that lovely, one of my favorite sequences ever, the circulating camera, and that hovers and that goes around the two of them, Carrie and Tommy, as they're dancing. And the lovely song that's being sung, and it just goes faster and faster and faster, and it's this way in which maybe it's a type of chaotic swirl, but it's also hypnotism, and it's also the moment of ultimate romance in the film, and exemplified by the swirling camera movement and the kiss and the connection that they're making. It is a truly beautiful moment, and it's held together by the performances, such as the great performance by William Katt here as Tommy Ross. So I love, that's one of my favorite Brian De Palma movie moments ever, actually, and it's so lovely, it's so romantic, it's so beautiful. And then things go to chaos and mayhem and murder and hell afterwards. But for the time being, it's a lovely romantic moment. Again, held together for many reasons. One of the main important reasons, of course, is the performance by William Katt. And then the other performances too, I mentioned, P.J. Soles is so wonderful. There is a type of almost sly, almost innocent, devilish nature about her, and she gets her comeuppance at the end, of course, but when she does, it's a very violent and traumatic thing. She wasn't a quote-unquote maybe she was somewhat antagonistic, maybe not to the same antagonistic heights or depths as Chris might have been, but still, she was somewhat of an antagonistic character vis-a-vis Carrie White. But when she gets her comeuppance at the end, it's quite a sad and vicious moment, actually. So there's another example of shifting perspectives, shifting POVs, suddenly jolting us out of our sort of a comfort zone and making us realize that indeed people that we thought might have been villainous at one point become victims before our very eyes. And it's not just shocking, but it's also quite sad and tragic at the same time. And then the opposite, let's continue on with that. Chris, Nancy Allen, this is such a great performance. This is so important because she is in many ways the ultimate antagonist of the film. She is monstrous in her own way, is she not? She manipulates Billy, not only manipulating Billy, but she goes for this ultimate, really gross prank of getting Billy to kill a pig, draw the blood from the pig, and put the blood in a bucket and pour the bucket on Carrie White at this ultimate moment of happiness. That's pretty sick. That's pretty sick indeed. So Chris is showing elements of what one might call escalation and taking things way out of proportion. In other words, the first humiliation of the shower sequence at the beginning leads to the consequence of Chris getting detention or running the risk of not being able to go to the prom. When she goes to detention, she is humiliated by Miss Collins, who slaps her in front of the group, and she leaves being totally humiliated herself. That leads to further escalation. She doesn't back down. She doesn't relent. Instead, she goes to the next step of asking Billy, or essentially using Billy or manipulating Billy in a type of sexual Machiavellian way to get him to kill the pig and draw the blood, and then help her on the ultimate prom dance prank. And then when things go to hell, that's where we see her expression change. She goes from villain to, in a sense, a type of almost hero or anti-hero, or at least that moment when she registers shock at the death of Miss Collins, when it goes into the window there, when she's looking from outside, her and Billy, that moment of shock, that's a moment where it's a kind of character turn. In wrestling parlance, a heel becomes a face, or at least to a certain degree, the heel becomes a face, which is another way of saying, a villain becomes a hero in a certain manner of speaking. We, in an interesting, strange way, almost sympathize with the shock that Chris is feeling, because it's at that moment that things have transformed so much so that Carrie White, who has been the victim of Chris all the way up to now, has become a monster, and Chris in turn sympathizes with the victims that are being killed before her very eyes. So that strange shift in perspective then leads to some really interesting character dynamics in the form of Chris's character in the hands of the great performance by Nancy Allen. And one other thing about Chris, she never gives up, does she? Even when she escaped, she and Billy, they could have gone away, they could have escaped forever and not have experienced what it is they experienced. But oh no, Chris does not give up all the way to the very end. She really wants to get at Carrie, so she tries to really hit her with the car, but Carrie won't have it, of course, and Carrie uses her powers to flip the car and make it explode. That's the end of Chris and Billy, but if you have to give Chris anything, it would be that she doesn't give up, does she not? Again, and that shows in the hands of Nancy Allen's performance, the escalation and the shifting perspectives, and the way in which she becomes almost a sympathetic character in one way, but she is also an antagonist in another way. And again, those nuances are handled so brilliantly in the performance. And then also associated with the Nancy Allen, and also associated with that Miss Collins, Betty Buckley's character. This is also such a key performance, as I say. There is a three-dimensionality to her. She is maybe not wholly sympathetic to Carrie White's situation, but she's still trying to help. And again, those moments of humanity that emerge, like when she's talking about her date at the prom, or when she's talking about how she felt like the other girls felt, or those flashes of anger that she feels towards Chris, towards Sue, etc. And her ultimate demise as well. It's very sad. It's very shocking. And again, even now, I question, or I wonder whether she really did laugh or not, whether her death was really quote unquote, I mean, I hesitate to say deserved, because no death is deserved, of course, but the idea, of course, what I mean is whether she was truly showing a type of mocking of a Carrie, or was it in Carrie's mind? Again, there was a little bit of room for possibility that indeed she could have been mocking her in actuality, because of these other glimpses, flashes of her personality that she showed, again, out of earshot of Carrie White. But in any event, that's one of the great nuanced performances. It's also a great show of a type of aggressive spirit. And again, if Carrie as a film is anything, it's a film that is filled with characters that are assertive and aggressive and don't let go. And Miss Collins is one of those characters. Betty Buckley's performance is great. Now, of course, that leads us to the great performance by Piper Laurie as Margaret White. Now, I mentioned that this film is a horror film, and it's a horror film because of the Carrie White telekinesis prom night disaster element, the blood and the telekinesis and the superpowers, and everyone dies, or almost everyone dies. So that's one a horror element. But arguably, the other horror element, the other monster in the room, is Margaret White. And in the hands of Piper Laurie, this towering, legendary, over-the-top figure is one of the great characters of a Brian De Palma film. It is one of the great characters of a Stephen King work. It's one of the great characters in the pantheon of great characters of Stephen King film adaptations, etc., etc. I mean, the possibility of laudatory compliments, I think, is endless for Piper Laurie's performance here. This is one of the great characters of the Brian De Palma body of work. It is monstrous. It is vicious. It's cruel. It's scary. Again, I point to, once again, that smile that Piper Laurie has on her face as she's coming down the stairs with the knife in her hand. It is frightening. And Carrie White does what she needs to do, which is do the thing with the knives and add a little insult to injury with the flip of one of the knives there, as she essentially impales her mother to death. And what happens to her mother? Does she go out quietly? Oh no, she does not go out quietly. She goes out with not with a whimper, but with a bang, and that bang being in the form of this almost orgasm-like scream that is also like the soul leaving her body in this final one last hurrah triumph, as it were. So in the hands of Piper Laurie, this is one of the most towering figures in all of the Brian De Palma filmography. It is one of, again, the most aggressive monsters of the film. And it's also very important, too, because it shows us the consequences of her upbringing of Carrie White and how this might have affected what ultimately happens with Carrie White in the film. Very, very important. Piper Laurie's performance is phenomenal. But the phenomenal performances, of course, don't end there, because we have the phenomenal performance of Sissy Spacek as Carrie White. And I think if I were to explain or give a reason or an example why, it will be also in relation to this point that I was trying to raise earlier about shifting perspectives, shifting POVs. And it's so emblematic in Carrie White in the hands of Sissy Spacek's performance, because in some parts, as I say, Sissy Spacek's Carrie can be sympathetic. She can be tragic. Our sympathies are so with her. We want her to succeed. We want her to find happiness. We want her to find love. We want her to We want her to have the confidence enough to feel like she can break free from her shell. There are moments where, again, in the hands of Sissy Spacek, her eye movement, the way that she's holding on to books as almost like a shield to protect her from further potential humiliation, the way that she's hesitating with her body language when she's at school, how that suddenly changes when she's with her mother, especially as the film progresses. She slowly gains confidence. She slowly has an understanding of what her powers are, and that shows manifests as a type of potential form of defiance vis-a-vis her mother. And so her posture is different. The way that her body language carries herself is different, and that is so great too. There are ways in which she is a tragic, humiliated figure. There are also moments where she is asserting herself, and she's a self-confident figure, and that's so great. And to the shifting perspectives also allow for Carrie White to become a monster, right? Because when she goes berserk, she really does, and when she goes berserk, our sympathies then go towards the victims, even to the point where we almost can sympathize with Chris as she's reacting in horror to what's happening from outside the window there, and Miss Collins and etc. Everyone becomes a victim. So Carrie White is the ultimate monster, and so the shifting perspective analysis is such that she can go from self-confidence to assertiveness to tragic, shy humiliation to monster. And then back to the sympathetic character that she was maybe at the beginning of the film. As she goes home, she's out of her trance, and she washes the blood clean in the bathtub, only to be attacked by her mother. So then she becomes not just a sympathetic character, but then a victim. And then she becomes a monster again while using her powers to defend herself. And then she becomes a victim again when she is befallen and the whole house is destroyed around her. And then she becomes an ultimate foil too, because she is a type of, at least in the dream sequence of Sue Snell, she becomes yet another victim, but also maybe a potential friend or someone to be rescued or saved by Sue Snell, again accompanied by this lovely romantic music of Pino Donaggio, only to, at the very last moment, shift into horror gear. Even in the dream sequence, in the mind and the heart of Sue Snell, Carrie White is a monster. So again, shifting perspectives is great. And going back to that in the context of Sissy Spacek's performance, it is electrifying. It is humanizing. It is so soft and delicate. It's also monstrous. The way that she is able to open her eyes when she gets into the trance during that prom scene, I mean, it's amazing, absolutely amazing. And so the physicality of the performance and the delicate nature of it and the softness in the voice that suddenly turns into this rage and the trance and the way that the physicality all the way to the way that she carries her hands as she's in the trance, they're kind of hooked upwards in a manner of speaking, as she walks down from the stage as everything is burning around her. Oh, my goodness, my goodness. Sissy Spacek's performance is another one for the ages. This is such a great performance. And so to conclude, my dear friends, let me say that I love this film. I have seen this film so many times. It is one of my favorite Brian De Palma films. It's one of my favorite Stephen King film adaptations for the reasons that I've tried to express in this video discussion. And it has been one of my favorite Brian De Palma films for a long time, and I dare say I know that it will continue to be one of my favorite Brian De Palma films for a long time to come. For these and other reasons, this is a keeper. This is a great film. This is a terrifying horror film that's also very effective, very suspenseful. That's also very romantic, very dramatic, very warm, very shocking, and then back to a horror film again. And then the circle repeats itself with great sense of cinematic flourish and entertainment and memorability all at once. What a great, great film this is. This is the Brian De Palma film from 1976, which is CARRIE. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now. If you have any thoughts or comments about this film, CARRIE, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. I would love to hear anytime, my dear friends, what it is you have to say about this film. But until the next video, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until the next video, my dear friends, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.